Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to Washington Crossing Historic Park. And this is our last in our lecture series for 2024. So thank you for coming out. And it's very special that you're here tonight because this is also our last for 2024 of our lectures in partnership with the American Philosophical Society and the David Center. So just a little housekeeping before we get started. For those of you who have been here before, you know the format. For those of you who are joining us on Zoom, hello Zoomers. I've seen some of the names on the registration sheet and I recognize some, so hello, great to have you. Let me read this before we get started. This session is being recorded for training and record-keeping purposes. By participating in this session, you are consenting to the recording, retention, and use of this session. At any time, if you have a question or comment, feel free to place that in the chat box and we will respond to you as soon as possible. If you would like to ask your question or comment verbally, please note that by doing so, you're consenting to the recording, retention, and use of your statements recorded as part of this session. That said, for our Zoom audience, you're not going to be able to ask questions verbally, so if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. For everyone else that's here, we are going to have our presentation, and afterward, there's going to be an opportunity for questions, and then you're all welcome to join us out in the Riverview room, where our guest is going to be signing copies of his book, which are available in the shop if you are interested. With that, I want to just tell everybody how delighted I am and Washington Crossing Historic Park is to have this wonderful partnership with the American Philosophical Society and the David Center. It has brought so much to our programs and to our visitors, and I am thrilled every single time that you come here. So I thank you for keep coming back. And with that, I'm going to introduce Brenna, who is going to come up and introduce our speaker. Brenna Holland, I'm sorry.
Hello all, welcome and good evening. My name is Brenna Holland. I'm the Assistant Director of Library Museum Programs at the American Philosophical Society. And I want to start by thanking Kim and her team here at Washington Crossing Historic Park for the warm welcome and for hosting these collaborative events here for the David Center for the American Revolution at the American Philosophical Society. So thank you again for welcoming another David Center speaker back here to Bucks County. So we hold these programs on the newest work on the American Revolution, typically one in the spring and one in the fall, near the David Library for the American Revolution's original home here in Bucks County. I'll give a little bit of background as well. In January 2020, the David Center for the American Revolution at the APS was founded, and the David Library's collections relocated to the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. So the David Center remains a collaboration between the David Library and the American Philosophical Society, and is dedicated to supporting scholarship on the American Revolution. The David Library's founder, Sol Feinstein, believed that the examination of the founding fathers' values and events of the revolutionary period are essential to creating an informed citizenry able to comprehend and adapt these founding principles to the ever-evolving circumstances of American society. The center champions the active engagement of scholars, educators, and the general public of all ages in a continuing and dynamic encounter with this most central episode in the creation of America. The American Philosophical Society, for its part, was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743. The society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts, and the humanities and public life. The society promotes research by providing I think about $2 million now in research grants a year, primarily to younger scholars who need that support the most. Several of these awards are funded by the David Center, which awards both long-term predoctoral and postdoctoral fellowships, as well as short-term research fellowships to do research in those collections that are now in Philadelphia. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. So please check out our website, www.amphilsoc.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events like this one. For today's program, our speaker, Dr. Michael Hattem, will talk about his new book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, just published with Yale University Press. Dr. Hattem comes to us just a little bit south. He comes to us from Connecticut, where he's Associate Director of the Yale New Haven Institute and Yale National Institute to Strengthen Teaching in Public Schools. He earned his master's and PhD from Yale University and has received a number of fellowships and awards that showcase the range of his research on the Revolution, including from the New York Historical Society, the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon, Massachusetts Historical Society, the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Historical Society of Philadelphia, and of course, the American Philosophical Society as well. He's the author of another book, Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, also published by Yale in 2020, and many articles that also showcase his interest in putting the past in conversation with the present. But you all came here tonight to hear from him. So it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Dr. Michael Hattem.
Thank you, everyone. I would like to begin by thanking the Historic Park and the David Center at the American Philosophical Society for inviting me to speak about my new book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. And I'm going to begin with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society about a decade ago. This is Eliza Wadsworth. She was a 20-year-old woman who lived at home with her family in Portland, Maine, around the turn of the 19th century. And in January 1800, having been so moved by the recent death of General Washington, she asked her father, Peleg, who had been a former Continental Army officer, then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, for a memento of the revolutionary hero. Papa, I will tell you what I want more than anything I think of at present. It is a scrap of General Washington's handwriting, perhaps his name. But then she went a step further and asked, Papa, had he hair? A lock of that I should value more highly still, but I suppose this impracticable. Well, Peleg's deep affection for his daughter prompted him to write to Martha Washington and enclose Eliza's letter. 2 weeks later, he received a letter from Tobias Lear, the Washington's personal secretary. In it, he wrote, the ardent wish expressed by your daughter and your earnest desire for its gratification have induced Mrs. Washington to comply with the request by sending the lock of hair I now have the honor to enclose. Shortly after, Eliza received a package in the mail from her father, and inside were 2 envelopes, one marked, read this first. In that envelope, a letter from Peleg read, you expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington. I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret. Eliza described what happened next. She said, I trembled with fear and dare not conjecture what it contained. Imagine my feelings when I opened the sacred paper with veneration and awe that for a moment I could not even shed a tear for so invaluable a gift. How shall I duly honor the relic, she wrote. I feel as if it was too great for me to possess. I want to give thousands who've never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy. Just 2 years later, though, Eliza was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she drafted a note about her most prized possession. The hair of General Washington I leave in the care of my sister. I wish it may be preserved in our own family while it can be safe. Eliza died on August 1st, 1802, and her letters and the lock of hair were preserved within the family. Her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. Eliza's story is about more than just a young woman and a lock of hair, though. It's emblematic of the deeply emotional connection to the memory of the revolution that Americans began to forge in the early 19th century, particularly as they started to realize that the revolutionary generation was rapidly disappearing. And that emotional connection has continued generation after generation throughout American history. And so I want to begin my talk tonight by exploring this phenomenon, this unique emotional relationship that Americans have had with their revolution for nearly 250 years. And I think that more deeply understanding that relationship has a lot to tell us about the past, about the present, and the future as we continue barreling our way toward the 250th anniversary of independence. The memory of the American Revolution, how the revolution is remembered in our political culture and our popular culture, is our national origin myth. Now, historians typically use the term myth in a rather simplistic way to mean a widely held misconception or an inaccurate or exaggerated story. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin myth, is a story that explains how a society or people came to be, and in the process defines its character and principles, and in doing so expresses a vision of the future. So to mythologize the revolution is not merely to tell inaccurate or exaggerated stories about it, but it's actually to tell the story of the revolution to explain how the United States came to be and to define the American character and to set an agenda for the nation's future. And so I want to really explore what it actually means that we have mythologized the revolution and explore a little bit about how that has worked and what it can tell us about Americans' relationship to the revolution. Myths are first and foremost stories. And like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has often been told in 3 acts. The first act has focused on the coming of the revolution. This features a succession of legislation and well-known events, including the Stamp Act, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, Lexington and Concord, all the way up to independence. The second act features the war and is typically structured around a timeline of major battles, Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, Yorktown. The third and final act has typically recounted how in the 1780s, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution. And so this traditional story structure has a logical beginning, middle, and end, and it gives the telling of the revolution a sort of inherent literary quality. But if we go a bit deeper, we find that the way that Americans have told this basic story has followed a familiar form. The hero's journey is a common narrative structure in Western mythology, first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. Put simply, it's a sequence of commonly recurring plot points that he found in his studies of many hero myths. In the 20th and 21st centuries, this structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell's work in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and more. And how Americans have told the story of the revolution for nearly 250 years, I want to suggest, has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. So typically at the start, the hero, or in our case, the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure. And after a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over its colonies, in 1774, Parliament passes the infamous Coercive Acts. And this unprecedented attack on colonial self-government caused colonists to create a Continental Congress. And typically the hero initially resists the call to adventure. Throughout 1774 and 75, Congress did refuse to consider independence and instead focused on trying to reconcile with Britain. Eventually, though, the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world. Of course, in July of 1776, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. The hero then undergoes a series of trials and temptations or challenges. And for the revolution, these trials are represented by many of the war's battles. Though rooted in actual history, some of the war's most famous stories feature in their retelling mythical themes and near mythological scenarios, such as the Continental Army's daring escape after the Battle of Brooklyn, when Washington engineers the crossing of his entire army in one night under a cover of darkness and thanks to an opportune fog, thereby avoiding a likely end to the revolution. Similarly, there is the successful attack on Trenton on Christmas Day, 1776, mythically depicted in Emanuel Litz's famous 1851 painting. When Washington crosses the Delaware with his ragtag army at night and scores an important victory against the feared Hessians mere days before the army's enlistments are about to end. Such tales have lent themselves well to the mythologizing of the revolution in our popular memory. And though these stories are rooted in actual historical events, they have been told and retold in ways that lend them mythical connotations, including telling them as though they represented direct interventions by God, lending a predestined and even providential nature to the origin myth for some. Now, often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor and later receives the timely aid of a helper. For the revolutionaries, that helper was France. And like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales, when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrives at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to cut off Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown possible, effectively ending the war and securing American independence. Now, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. In our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. They then undergo a transformation into a new confederation of states. But as they quickly come to realize that the new government is not working, they reach the moment of atonement and call a constitutional convention in 1787. And once the atonement is complete, they receive the gift of the goddess, the Constitution, and return to the known world, which is now changed for the better thanks to the hero having undertaken their adventure and the illuminating revelations or principles that they bring back with them. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us without being explicit. The mythical, literary, and religious traditions of the West have essentially culturally hardwired us in such a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses. That the story of the revolution has often been told like this helps us, I think, better understand Americans' unusual emotional connection to the revolution. And stories like this kindle intense emotional connections in part because they're usually intended to foster one's sense of belonging to a community. After all, Americans have long identified with a cast of unlikely underdogs who become larger than life heroes by surviving a series of trials and achieving a seemingly providential victory against all odds over the world's most evil empire. There is a real civic power that comes from individuals collectively imagining themselves as the descendants of heroes who achieved the impossible. And many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, particularly I think in the 19th century, have had emotional experiences akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, or Harry Potter. This mythologizing of the memory of the revolution has historically provided a nation that is still relatively young with an epic mythical past replete with heroes, villains, peril, daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world, and meaningful revelations about how the world or the nation should be. Throughout, there is a sense that good and evil exist, that they're clearly delineated, and most important, that the former triumphs over the latter. It's the myth of the beginning of a new age. And by casting Americans as both its heralds and its heirs, the nature of the popular memory of the revolution has lent a weight laden with meaning, purpose, and destiny to the American identity for more than 2 centuries. And this is in no small part why the revolution has been so central to our politics, culture, and national identity for nearly 250 years. And I think that understanding the form in which the story has been told helps us to understand Americans' emotional connections to their origin story. Now, there is actually a field of study known as fandom studies that explores how people and groups relate to such stories and other facets of popular culture, how they express their emotional connections to those stories, and how those connections influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with their fellow fans. One of the most common ways that fans of stories like this do these things is through conventions, annual events where people who share a love of these stories or a specific story gather to discuss and express their connections to them. And Americans do the same for the American Revolution every July 4th, every time they visit places like this park or Mount Vernon or Independence Hall. Another way that they express their emotional connection to stories is through cosplay, where fans dress up as their favorite characters from their stories. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. We also see this in our political culture if we look back recently only to the Tea Party rallies of the 2010s. Still another way that these emotional connections to stories are expressed is through fan fiction. There are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories featuring the characters of Star Wars or Harry Potter. Americans have done this too by creating and reading historical fiction. That is, stories set in the Revolutionary era and often featuring real-life characters. And of course, one of the most popular of these from the 20th century was Johnny Tremaine. A fourth way that fans engage with stories is through fan art, or creating artwork that depicts famous scenes from these stories. And of course, we have very famous examples of artwork depicting the story of the revolution. And though this is not a comprehensive list, a final way that I'll mention is that fans visit recreations of the world of their stories. Fans of Harry Potter can visit Universal Studios and walk down Diagon Alley, when Lord of the Rings fans can go to New Zealand and visit the preserved set of the Shire. People visit them because they want to inhabit the stories that they have a deep connection to, and because it strengthens their connection to the stories and to the community of fans. And this is the same reason that many people have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg, the Boston Freedom Trail, or Independence National Historical Park. So we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the revolution have similarities to these fan cultures, which are created when stories take hold of people's imaginations and they establish such deep emotional connections to these stories that they go on to form a part of their personal identity. And in turn, then lead them to create and become part of a shared community. After all, nations are in no small part held together by the stories that they tell about themselves and their origins, and are as much a literary creation as they are a political creation. And I think that, you know, the similarities between this type of fandom and this commemorating and relationship to the revolution suggests something really elemental about how we as humans relate to mythologized stories and the effects that they have on us. And so I would suggest that the power of the memory of the revolution comes in no small part because it's an origin myth told in the form of a hero myth. And this is, I think, contributed to Americans developing a unique emotional connection to the memory of the revolution. And a big part of that is how the story is told. Now, there is another origin of the revolution's hold on the American imagination that goes back to a pre-revolutionary cultural inheritance from Britain. And I think that this can also help us understand Americans' connection to the revolution and also their sort of use of the memory of it. In the 18th century, many British subjects believed that history was cyclical rather than linear, and that empires and civilizations rose when their people had a sort of collective hunger for political power and economic prosperity, but that once a society achieved those things, the people tended to become profligate and concerned with their own self-interest over the public good, which would lead ultimately to their inevitable decline. Now, believing that this cycle had played out across history, British thinkers in the early 18th century argued that the best way for any society to temporarily forestall its inevitable decline was by recommitting to its quote-unquote first principles. Now, of course, since 1776, Americans have looked for their first principles in the revolution. And the conflicts that we have had over the meaning and the legacy of the founding for the last 250 years have been in no small part about choosing, defining, and justifying the most important first principles of the revolution. As I show in my book, the first principles that Americans choose and the ways that they define them have changed significantly over time. And there have often been multiple conflicting definitions of these principles at any given time. But this idea of returning to first principles to forestall an inevitable decline suggests that there is a kind of protection in looking back to the past. And so whether Americans are aware of it or not, we have sort of inherited and intensified this notion that there is some kind of protection to be had from looking back to our founding. And I think this too helps explain our emotional connection to the memory of the revolution. But what Americans have done with that emotional connection, what first principles they have found in the revolution and used the revolution to justify, has varied as widely as the political spectrum. Because even within the general structures that I've laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific character or meaning to the revolution. And that's what a popular memory is, or a historical memory. It is a way of telling or interpreting a story about the past to attribute specific meanings to it. Now, as my book shows, Americans have interpreted the revolution and its meaning in many different and often conflicting ways. And most of them, even the ones that directly contradict one another, tend to be rooted in the actual history of the revolution. But of course, none of them on their own are the whole truth, and that's because the revolution was too rich and complex an event, carried out by too diverse an array of peoples, to ever be distilled into a single story or a single narrative, or to have one single meaning. After all, the founding generation itself never agreed on what the revolution meant or what its first principles were. And all of that is to say that there is no single correct meaning or interpretation of the revolution. As a national origin myth, that complexity has allowed the memory of the revolution to be constantly contested and adopted by Americans across the political spectrum. And the meanings that we attribute to it often reflect our own times and are typically intended to justify previously held beliefs. And so how we talk about the revolution often reveals far more about the present than the past, and far more about us than about the revolution. Essentially, the revolution, I would argue, has provided a shared political language that has mediated and helped shape many of our most divisive and hard-fought political conflicts. And I want to give you an example of that from the early to mid-19th century. For much of the nation's first 50 years, the Declaration of Independence primarily symbolized independence from Britain and the Union of the States. And for that reason, the most important part of it was the grievances and the final paragraph, not the preamble with its universal statement of rights and equality. But that began to change in the 1830s with the rise of abolitionism. In fact, it was the abolitionist movement that created the modern memory of the Declaration of Independence as defined by the preamble and the principles of liberty and equality rather than independence and union. Abolitionist writers and orators repeatedly mentioned the Declaration, including notably here in the first issue of The Liberator in 1831, which was one of the most important abolitionist newspapers of the era. Introducing the new publication, William Lloyd Garrison explained the symbolism behind publishing the newspaper in Boston. He writes, "I determined at every hazard to lift up the standard of emancipation in the eyes of the nation within sight of Bunker Hill and in the birthplace of liberty." Then he continued, ascending to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population. Similarly, abolitionists meeting in Vermont passed a resolution stating that slavery in 1833 is incompatible with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And in 1839, the Old Colony Slavery Society, Anti-Slavery Society in Plymouth, Massachusetts, resolved that the Declaration was, quote, the fundamental document of our national existence. In other words, the abolitionists defined the Declaration by the principle of equality, and they defined the revolution by the Declaration. This, of course, did not escape the notice of Southerners. In a newspaper in South Carolina in 1835, one pro-slavery writer dismissed the phrase, all men are created equal, as, quote, merely a rhetorical flourish, and claimed that upon this proposition, false as it is, rests the wild theories of liberty held by so many. In the hands of the abolitionists, Southerners claimed that the Declaration had become, quote, a very seditious instrument. For them, the Constitution was the fundamental or defining document of the revolution. After all, the Constitution had been the best tool for protecting slavery through repeated compromises and even Supreme Court decisions. In the 1840s, Garrison and his followers also began to see the Constitution as the greatest impediment to abolition. And that notion was stoked by the first publication of James Madison's Notes from the Constitutional Convention in 1840. Before that, Americans really knew very little about what had happened in the Constitutional Convention. But now they could read the debates over representation and the compromises that had been made to slave states. In 1844, Wendell Phillips, noted abolitionist, published a compilation of those portions of the notes that dealt with slavery in a book called The Constitution, a Pro-Slavery Compact, that he claimed showed, quote, most clearly the details of that compromise which was made between freedom and slavery in 1787. And the main audience that he was targeting was actually his fellow abolitionists, who had long argued that the revolution and the revolutionaries, including slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson, had been decidedly anti-slavery. For Garrison, Phillips, and their followers, the Constitution was corrupted from the start because of this compromise. As a result, the Garrisonians began to call for disunion, because slavery could never be abolished under a constitution that began with compromises to slaveholders. Now, not all abolitionists agreed with him. In his famous speech on July 5th, 1852 in Rochester, New York, Frederick Douglass, a former ally of Garrison, said, I differ from those who charge this baseness on the framers of the Constitution. It is a slander upon their memory, and interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document. This abolitionist reinterpretation of the Constitution as a pro-slavery document culminated in a famous incident on July 4th, 1854 in Framingham, Massachusetts. During his speech, Garrison famously pulls out of his pocket a copy of the Constitution, declares it to be a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, and sets it aflame as the crowd cheers. These two founding documents were seen by both sides as fundamentally different and in opposition to one another. The Radical Declaration with its pronouncements of liberty and equality, or the Constitution which established and maintained law and order and slavery. And abolitionists and pro-slavery Southerners fought over which document and hence which principles defined the revolution and by extension defined the nation. In some sense, the abolitionists hoped that the Declaration would help save the nation from slavery, while Southern Democrats hoped that the Constitution would save slavery from the Declaration. By the time of Lincoln's election and the secession that followed, Southerners' relationship to the Revolution had become strained. In 1857, George Fitzhugh, a well-known Southern writer, argued that, quote, liberty and equality are new things under the sun. In other words, these were not principles that had come from the Revolution. Instead, they were new Northern principles that he blamed for all the problems that beset the North, including crime, immigration, and democracy. And increasingly, many Southerners came to see Jeffersonian democracy as having made abolition possible, thanks to the tyranny of the majority. Jefferson himself was described as a fanatical political monomaniac who was the, quote, father of all the calamities that are now being visited upon the nation. And the Declaration was described as an instrument more properly expressive of the passionate and delirious ravings of a Parisian mob than the calm, dignified, and deliberate utterance of a nation. At the same time, a number of well-known Southern writers began to craft a new memory of the Constitution. They claimed that the founders never intended the union of the Constitution to be perpetual, arguing that the founders signed on to the Constitution with the understanding that states could leave whenever they want. J.D.B. Du Bois argued that the government created by the Revolution had, quote, the seeds of death planted in its Constitution because it tried to force together two fundamentally different and irreconcilable societies. Now, arguments like this were highly charged, and they were as emotional as they were intellectual, and they had to be in order to convince fellow Southerners to break their emotional connection to the Revolution. And ultimately, to establish a new nation, Southerners had to reimagine the origin myth of the United States in a way that would justify the creation of their own nation and serve as the basis for a new Confederate origin myth. Now, this is one of many examples of partisan conflicts over the memory of the Revolution in my book. But I also want to give you a sense of just how far across the political spectrum the memory of the Revolution has been used, from the far left to the far right. In the 1930s, as part of its Popular Front strategy, the Communist Party of the United States of America used the founders and the memory of the Revolution to redefine itself and its agenda as an extension of the nation's revolutionary ideals and heritage. They adopted the slogan, "Communism is the Americanism of the 20th century." We see here combined with the famous late 19th century painting, The Spirit of '76. The CPUSA found great value in reminding Americans that, quote, this country won its independence in a great liberating revolutionary struggle. And as a group who wanted to see the end of economic classes, they adopted the Declaration of Independence as a radical expression of equality at the heart of the nation's founding. The Communist Party continues the traditions of 1776, they claimed. And indeed, it was in these years that the CPUSA enjoyed its widest following. At the same time, on the far right, the German-American Bund, an American pro-Nazi group led by German immigrants, was also using the memory of the Revolution to aid in its cause of isolationism and anti-Semitism. The Bund's goal was to oppose American intervention into World War II, and Washington was a popular symbol for the Bund because of his farewell address, which famously called on future generations of Americans to stay out of European wars. On the evening of February 20th, 1939, the Bund held a pro-America rally at the old Madison Square Garden in New York City to commemorate Washington's birthday. More than 15,000 people attended the rally, where the stage featured an imposing backdrop with a 30-foot full-length image of George Washington flanked by 1776 flags and swastikas. The speakers warned that as more Americans favored entering World War II, quote, "We are utterly and completely disregarding the admonition of George Washington today." The Bund used Washington in the memory of the revolution for its purpose of isolationism, but also because they knew its emotional power would help them appeal to native-born Americans who were typically wary of such foreign organizations. And ultimately, they tried to convince Americans that Nazism was a continuation of the American Revolution, and a not insignificant number of Americans were persuaded. Between these two examples, I want to give you a sense of how the memory of the revolution has been used successfully, even by groups at the furthest ends of the political spectrum. And part of the reason that that has been possible is because of this unusual emotional connection to the revolution and the power of legitimacy that the memory of the revolution conveys in our political culture. But it's not just partisan division that can change the memory of the revolution or cause political conflicts to arise. And so I want to tell one more story. This is Robert Goldstein. He was a Jewish German-American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. And after the success of D.W. Griffith's 1915 film, The Birth of a Nation, Goldstein became convinced that a similar large-scale historical epic film about the American Revolution could be just as successful. So he raised a large amount of funding for what would be the first full-length feature film about the American Revolution. Despite his total lack of experience, Goldstein wrote, directed, and produced the movie himself. That film, The Spirit of 76, debuted in Chicago in May of 1917, 1 month after the US had officially joined the war against Germany with its new ally, Great Britain. Throughout the 19th century, Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the revolution. But relations between the two countries had become more friendly around the turn of the 20th century. In attendance at this pre-screening were some critics and the city's controversial police censor board. And though one critic described the film as patriotic, the head of the censor board, a man named Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser, disagreed. He objected to scenes that showed British atrocities, including a British soldier ransacking an American house and sticking his bayonet through a baby's crib. There was also another scene that showed a British soldier assaulting a young American woman. These scenes, he said, would, quote, arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of our allies in the present war. So Funkhauser seized the film and called the Justice Department. Eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show it so long as he deleted the offending scenes. And we don't really know why, but before the film premiered in LA in November of 1917, Goldstein restored the deleted scenes. He was arrested immediately after the premiere and charged under the Espionage Act, which had been passed just a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent against the war. Bail was set at $10,000. The LA Daily Times ran the headline, "War of Revolution Film Seized by Government." The case went to trial and it was presided over by Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe, who agreed that the film would arouse our revenge and question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. The media reported unfounded rumors that Goldstein was a German agent and that the film was German propaganda. Ultimately, Goldstein was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. He was released from prison early in 1921 thanks to a review of Espionage Act prosecutions. But after a sort of a quick and unsuccessful effort to revive the film, he ended up leaving the United States in search of work. He next turns up in the historical record in Nazi Germany in 1935, where he was arrested for being unable to afford to renew his passport. Now, this story is an example of how the politics of the times can shape the ways that we remember the revolution. Goldstein thought he was making a patriotic film based on the memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Britain was the evil enemy. His story is also a reminder of the great power of the memory of the revolution that we learn when we're young, and of how difficult it can be to let that memory go as we get older and newer memories of the revolution emerge to challenge or replace it. Goldstein's great tragedy is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war, and that the old memory had not only become outdated, but legally treasonous. If Goldstein had released his film a few years earlier or a few years later, things would likely have turned out very differently for him. Instead, he was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution, which is lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of '76 has ever been found. Now, this is just one example of how foreign affairs can affect the memory of the revolution. And in my book, I also explore how the rise of the Cold War in the 1950s and the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s also caused significant changes to how the revolution was remembered. Now, I want to argue that the revolution matters most in the present, not because it happened, but because we remember it. Though the founders created the nation state itself, so much of the original governments and the politics envisioned by the founders no longer exists. The federal constitution and state constitutions have been amended and in the latter's case, rewritten many times. In many ways, we have been living under a government of which just the barest bones of the structure was created by the revolution and the founders. And indeed, many founders claim that the revolution had already been corrupted, betrayed, or mangled beyond recognition in their own lifetimes, not least by democracy. And so we simply no longer understand politics or society in the way that the founders did. And so I would argue that the revolution has mattered primarily because we remember it and because of the unique role that its memory plays in American life. The memory of the revolution has served most importantly as a vehicle of expression and a shared political language through which Americans define not only the past, but the present and the future. And though the memory of the revolution can sometimes seem to have done more to divide than unite us, I would argue that fighting over the meaning of the revolution reveals an underlying shared perception about the importance of the revolution as our national origin story. And so I've tried to explore tonight just what it means that we mythologize the revolution and how that's worked, how it's sort of played out in the practice of American politics. And at the heart of that is the importance of how we tell the story of the revolution. How you tell the story of the revolution matters greatly. And if there's anything readers of my book should take away, it's a greater awareness of how the story of the revolution is being told in any given context. I've also tried to show that how we tell the story of the revolution has fostered this unusual emotional connection between Americans and their revolution as a way of helping to try to better understand the revolution's unique role in our political culture. And I think part of that is that the memory of the revolution has provided us with this shared political language that allows it to be an important tool for communicating across the many divides inherent in such a diverse nation and polity. And ultimately, the memory of the revolution has been an important way that Americans express their political beliefs in the present and their visions of the future. And it has long been part of our birthright and our civic duty as American citizens to determine what the revolution means to us. Each new generation has produced multiple new memories of the revolution, often in direct conflict with each other. And as a result, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When Americans look at the revolution, we are effectively looking into a mirror. We define ourselves in part by how we define the revolution. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. The revolution is always in the eye of the beholder, and though many may claim sole ownership of it, in a democracy, no one owns the past. The memory of the revolution belongs to each and every one of us to make of it what we will, for better and worse. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Hi, Samuel Dodd, historian of American religion. And so much of what you said today got me thinking about the origins and the purpose of civil religion in the American experiment. And I would like to know what you think about this tension you've highlighted between the need for a common mythology and what religious historians call a civil religion, a sort of religious function in a diverse community, but yet the reality, the historical reality of no single memory, no single history, no single story of the revolution. How do you produce an effective and useful civil religion from such a complex and incoherent history? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a large question. But I would say, what the structures that I laid out here are, let's say, accommodating, right? They've been used, that basic narrative that I laid out early in the talk, you can use that same narrative structure and give it tons of different meanings, depending on what parts of the story you focus on, depending on what parts of the story you pick to fill any of those common plot points, right? You can tell the revolution, for example, as you could tell the story of the revolution in a way in which the Constitution represents the culmination of the revolution. You could tell the story of the revolution in a way that the Constitution represents a counter-revolution, right? And you could do it using that same narrative structure, right? So I would say that, but I think also that what that means is that there isn't necessarily a need for a single narrative, right? There's never been a single meaning that comes out of multiple narratives, and I think that that's a perfectly fine thing. I think the fact that we fight over the meaning of the revolution is a good thing. I think it's a healthy thing for our political culture, and that it has played an important role in our politics for nearly 250 years. The other angle of that is that, ever since let's say since the bicentennial, the memory of the revolution the popular memory of the revolution has undergone significant changes just in the last 50 years, right? And a big part of that has been the expansion of the cast of characters who are included in that popular memory, right? So historians are always working, sometimes within that narrative structure, sometimes without, sometimes knowing, sometimes unwittingly, working to come up with new and different ways to tell the story, and give those stories the meanings that they want to convey.
So Roger Williams, it's not quite a question. He basically says, he mentions the complimentary choice of using the Apotheosis of Washington on the cover, and he says, can you talk a bit on how the art of Trumbull, Peel, Loitza, and others helped foster the myth of the revolution?
Yeah, that's a great question too. There's a really good book on this called "The Arms and Artists." But obviously, the art of the revolution, if we think of Trumbull, the paintings in the Capitol, or the ones at the Yale Art Gallery, or Manuel Lutz's famous painting, those works, I think it can be hard to, or I think it's easy to underestimate the impact that those works had, especially in the 19th century. Just the sheer visual nature of them. I mean, in my first book, I have an example where Abigail Adams is in London while her husband was the ambassador, and this is when she first sees John Trumbull's painting of Bunker Hill, and she describes this a really intense emotional experience that she had seeing the revolution depicted, in a visual way. And of course, those paintings spread somewhat in the late 18th century through prints, but then across the 19th century, there are lots more visual representations, and they have a huge effect on transmitting the memory of the revolution. I mean, this behind me is really just a testament to that. I think the other thing too is that the apotheosis of Washington that's on the cover of my book, the thing that's important about that is that is painted underneath the rotunda of the Capitol of the United States, right? So this is commissioned in the mid 19th century, and so when you go to visit the Capitol, the seat of the legislature of the Republic, and you see this government-sanctioned artwork depicting Washington as a god rising up to heaven with these other, Roman and Roman gods, then it's that sends a pretty clear message, and it goes back to the first question about religion and civil religions. These are ways in which aspects of our religious life and our political life can come together to enhance one another.
Thank you. Andrew Tegel, I'm an editor with Jefferson Papers. My question for you is, where do mundane objects fit in the memory of the American Revolution? And I ask because sometime I think in the 1950s, this insurance company produced a very good facsimile of the Jefferson letter. So every couple of years, someone emails and says, "Hey, I've got this Jefferson letter.
Yeah.
Might be a big deal." How has the mundane representation of the Revolutionary period changed over time?
Yeah, that's a great question about the role of sort of mundane, material objects. I talk a little bit about this in the book. So in the early 19th century, specifically around the visit of Lafayette, I mean, that Lafayette's visit was highly commercialized, right? In a way that was, it was, if not new, was really was significant. At Lafayette College, they have an enormous collection of items featuring Lafayette's face and name on them, everything from snuff boxes to, I mean, in the book here, there's a glass jar, there's all kinds of items, including textiles. And then the same thing, happens around major events like around the centennial. There was these mini Liberty Bells were sent out all across the nation. Every school child was supposed to have gotten one of these little centennial bells, and I mean, what is the role that these things play? I mean, why do people buy something in a gift shop at a historical site, right? Like you take some part of that site home with you, and it just goes more towards this idea of fostering or developing a personal connection to this great a much greater event, right? That people already have an emotional connection to through the story. And I think material objects just provide another sort of everyday and personal way to encounter that story, right? Or feel connected to it. Great question.
Anyone else? Oh, all right, one more.
Harry Lewis sort of asks, he mentions how in England, the revolution is, he says it's called the Third English Civil War, and he basically asks, other countries, I guess, interpret the revolution differently. The revolution's interpreted differently in England than it is over here, or Britain rather. Can you comment on, how, I guess, the myth of the revolution has taken on a different meaning for these other states that were involved in it?
I mean, I am only a historian of the United States, so I can't really speak to how the memory of the revolution, the memory of the American Revolution in Britain. But I mean, it is the case that the memory of the revolution has had an impact beyond the borders of the United States. The Declaration of Independence specifically, there's a book about the global history of the Declaration of Independence by David Armitage. That is a really interesting read about how other countries have adopted the Declaration or part of the language of the Declaration of Independence and used it in their own independence movements, right? So yeah, there is a book being written now about the global global memory of George Washington. So there is a long tradition of the memory of the revolution being remembered outside the United States that unfortunately is outside the purview of this book.
Well,